When it comes to our 2050 climate aspirations, large emitters carry both responsibility and potential for substantially improving our emissions profile. Our next session this morning is brought to us by Aurecon, and I'd like to welcome Aurecon's Director for Sustainability and Climate Change, Waning Chua. Good job, Waning.
Wow, they weren't kidding when they say it's lonely at the top, even including top of the stage. Everyone sits at the back. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning, everyone. I'm from Aurecon, and I feel I need to tell you that I'm not an engineer. I've held several strategy, commercial, and risk roles across multiple public and private sector entities. That's given me a unique perspective as to how businesses can manage climate risks and how they put in place mitigation and adaptation practices in place. This morning, Jack talked about how in the last decade, a lot of conversation has shifted from mitigation to now into adaptation. I just want to bring us into kind of the balance of mitigation and adaptation. At the end of this conversation, I want you to take away two things from this conversation. First thing, Fast and Furious. Half of the room would have seen the movie. But what I want you to take away is that climate change is happening at a fast and furious pace. We may think that we are ready to adapt. We may think that we put in place enough mitigation or need to do more. We may be surprised by how fast it is approaching. Some of us may have seen a UN scientist reports that was released recently saying that we are on track to a 1.5 degree scenario by 2027. That's 4 years from now. So fast and furious, number one, which means our actions need to be fast and furious as well. The second thing I want you to take away today is no actions, no results. All you have is a good story. So an old leader that I used to work with always challenged me on that. So no actions, no results. So what I want to talk to you about today are three things. So the first thing I'll start off with why we need to have this conversation now. Two, I'll proceed to share with you a pathway that we've co-developed with our clients to help them manage their climate risks and also the decarbonization pathway. Then I'll share with you some of the decarbonization ideas that Aurecon helped brought to life, and I'll be leaving you with a gift as you walk out the door today. Not the tangible things that you've been collecting since yesterday. It will be a question that you can take away back into your daily lives or into your workday that will challenge how things are done. Why do we need to have this conversation now? You must have heard a whole bunch of people talking about how dire the situation is. This is a chart from the IPCC AR6 report. This is New Zealand. This is what the New Zealand climate is predicted to look like in the next 20 to 30 years, or consistent with a 2-degree climate. But we know it is not too far away. It is here, actually. And New Zealand will continue to be drier. Yes, I got that right. It is drier. Despite Cyclone Gabrielle, what will happen is we'll be dry, 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 binge rainfall, dry, 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 binge rainfall. Two things that I think about. First thing, with a primary sector-driven country, are our agriculture, horticulture sector resilient enough to adapt to that? What is that going to look like in the future? Second thing I think about is infrastructure. I don't want to elaborate on that. You guys are probably experts in these areas. Given my commercial background, I want to talk to you about money. Have a look at this chart. This is a chart from the International Monetary Fund. On the y-axis, you can see the world adaptive capacity. That's how well these regions are ready to adapt in terms of climate change impact. On the x-axis, you can see is the exposure index, is how exposed you are to climate change impact. New Zealand's obviously lumped into the Asia and the Pacific region. You can see our world adaptive capacity is on par. Our adaptive capacity is on par with the world adaptive capacity, but we are slightly more exposed. I'll get to that point in a bit. So I think about if I'm a global investor and I have $1, where would I place that money? Would I place it into Asia and the Pacific, or would I much rather put it in Europe? I understand that maybe 2 days ago, a New Zealand climate scientist came out and released some information around how New Zealand's more sheltered in terms of climate change. We are less exposed. Imagine if we can adapt, we have a higher adaptive capacity. How attractive would our country be as an investor region? Bring it back home to New Zealand. I won't elaborate too much on that because previously Simon Watts talked about agriculture and energy-related emissions. So on average, New Zealand emits about 80 million tons of carbon per annum. And 90% of that is sitting in agriculture and energy. Prior to Oricon, I was working for the Energy Efficiency Conservation Authority, EECA, and I led strategy there. EECA's purpose is mobilizing New Zealanders to be world leaders in clean and clever energy use. So my past life was focusing on energy efficiency, trying to get people to reduce their demand, and trying to get people to switch over to renewable fuels. Now within Oricon, I lead a decarbonization function, so we continue to deliver energy decarbonization, now in the wider context of climate, physical, and transition risk management. Before I proceed to the next part of my conversation, I should say this is my first time at Building Nations. Could you please help me understand who I'm talking to? I won't get you to stand up, but could you please raise your hand if you're a board member? Great, thank you. That's like 5% of the room. Could you please raise your hand if you work for a policy organization? It could be a central or a local government agency. A few more, thank you. Could you raise your hand if you work for a delivery agency or a consulting business? Ta-da! And don't forget, if you are a financier or an investor. Yes, a few of us. Don't worry, I know that there are some people who have not raised your hands. You belong in what I call an infrastructure user group, like everyone else who have used their hands. Regardless of what role you play in this ecosystem, the organization that you're in, this is likely your headspace. You are trying to run your business, your organization. You're trying to be healthy and safe, working out operational excellence, inflationary pressure, and also the longer-term strategy of your business. Now you're surrounded by all of these climate change responsibilities. It's not new, it's been around for a while, but there's more pressing urgency for you to act. And there's a lot of trade-offs and balancing that as leaders, whether you're leaders of self, people leaders, or senior leaders in an organization, how do you balance the two sort of contradictory priorities that you need to manage? So you are at the right place at the right time because the next section of my presentation will solve it all for you. Great, some of you laughed because there was a joke. Now that I have your attention, let me share with you a pathway to decarbonization that we've co-developed with our clients. Look, we believe there are at least 6 steps. This is not everything you do to progress down on a pathway to decarbonization. So no, I'm not going to run you through all the details step by step of what you need to do here, but I'll run you through a few key learnings that we have and a few sort of catch-outs that you need to think about at each step of the way. Strategy, risks, and opportunities. Position. Does your organization or do you truly understand the risks and opportunities, both from a physical risk and a transition risk perspective? How you're going to position your organization as we transition to a low-carbon economy. And often we look at physical risk in isolation, and then we never look at transition risk and look at the interactions between the two. I have heard all of yesterday about how funding, money is tight. So roadmap, sequencing matters. We know we're not going to fork out a large lump sum of money and decarbonize our whole organization in one go. But if you're running a light commercial fleet and you're not electrifying it, you're probably leaving some value on the table. So come and talk to us. Enablers. It is not always just about the technology. Later, I'm going to share with you an example of how we've supported a client on its decarbonization journey and some of the commercial negotiations and deals, and including some government funding that we sought on behalf of this client, are true factors that actually unlock that opportunity for them. At the design, construct, and operate stage, fit. We all talk about human-centered design and community and stakeholder management. Do we truly understand the needs of the user today versus the needs of the user tomorrow? Are the assets you're building now fit for purpose or fit for the future? It is always very exciting to build a new asset. You look forward to the commissioning date, and everyone's happy. However, that's where the journey begins. Have you thought about how you're going to integrate this new asset into your asset lifecycle management? Is operational readiness a key thing for you? Lastly, climate-related disclosures. How many of you work for an organization that has a climate-related target? Could you please raise your hand? Excellent. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if your organization has a target and you don't have a roadmap. But if you don't have a roadmap and you have a target, my recommendation is get started on that roadmap now, because there's a long lead time. But if you don't have a target, don't get FOMO. Don't just go out and announce a number and say, we'll figure it out. You may have seen on the news recently that a leader from a large global mining business indicated that they regretted their ambitious climate target. It's not because they're not up for it. They just realized as they started to implement plans towards achieving these targets, how much interdependencies exist within the ecosystem. So as I mentioned previously, I worked for ICA in my past life. And as part of that, I was privileged enough to lead the program design of the Government Investment in Decarbonizing Industry Fund. So it's focusing on decarbonizing industrial process heat. Despite the government's best intent to accelerate decarbonization in this sector, we still have to manage the capacity and capability constraint in the market. I promised you some example, so let's go to Gore. Mataura Valley Milk. This is a client of ours. So we have supported this client on its journey to decarbonization. And so the client is actually burning coal to produce process heat. And we are supporting the client to commission New Zealand's first high-pressure electric boiler. So all the steps are there. I won't go through them. But there are 5 key factors I want to run through with you. So this is when I say technology is not the only reason or not the only factor that helps people decarbonize. First thing, so ICA GIDI Fund, so that was the fund I was talking about before. We managed to secure $5 million GIDI Fund as part of this application process through maintaining great relationships with ICA's account managers. Options analysis. It's critically important that you do not discount options at the very beginning. When we first started this, we didn't think electricity was an option because it is too expensive. How many of us have heard that before? And as you can see, after several detailed analysis rounds, we managed to secure a really good power price purchase agreement for over a 10-year period versus the very volatile biomass market. So the PPA negotiations was key. We managed to deliver the business case up to sort of on par with the biomass boiler. And electricity infrastructure. The moment you put in place an electric boiler on site, you need to bring more electrons on site. In this case, we managed to bring forward some of Transpower's electricity infrastructure upgrade, so which means these guys didn't have to pay for the capital for the full size upgrade, just the delta in between. Lastly, design and procurement. So this is where I talk about asset management. So I am not an engineer, so I had thought putting an electric boiler in place means ripping the old coal boiler out, put a new electric boiler on site. I learned a new term called a demineralized water plant. Essentially means very, very high quality water. So this demin water plant is required to support this electric boiler, which means these guys need to learn, we had to purchase a new demin water plant from Spain, and that adds to the sort of operational part of the process. Because I'm coming to speak to infrastructure folks, so I thought I would share with you a little bit about Auckland Light Rail. So Auckland Light Rail, it is more than just a transport project. It's an urban regeneration and transport project. It talks about urban intensification, and previously we talked about, maybe I won't go there. So it is about so we are practicing this, what we call carbon management and infrastructure. So I'm just going to focus on avoid and reduce space. And we are at a very early stage of this program, and we're focusing on building the business case with Arup. We're keeping the project as lean as we can. Don't build things we don't need. Don't tunnel and trench as little as we need. As part of the assessment, we found that Auckland is actually on a bed of volcanic rocks. So basalt is incredibly hard. And I didn't even think of the fact that if you tunnel a trench, you actually need to use a lot more energy, in this case, off-road diesel, of which we don't have a lot of electrification technology that stacks up financially right now. So we're trying to reduce as much tunneling and trenching as we can. We're figuring out where to put a station so that urban regeneration and transport actually make sense from the user's perspective. So often when you start projects like this, you need to think a longer term and more across the whole ecosystem. This is the gift that I promised you. There are a few questions. Remember previously I asked you who you were in the room? I've kind of sectioned a few questions that you can take away with you regardless of what role you play in this ecosystem. If you're a board member, do you believe your organization is doing everything it can to manage climate risks? If not, are you asking enough questions of management to challenge their thinking and their actions? If you're a policymaker, we all know that, how might we actually set policies to incentivize system interactions? Could you actually broaden the scope of your policy setting to take into account different components of the ecosystem to deliver better outcomes for one Aotearoa? If you're a delivery agency or partner, so I spoke about this previously, around whether your asset you're delivering now, is it fit for purpose now, and or is it fit for the future? Investors, what are some of the hidden risks in your portfolio that you don't know? This includes asking questions and be inquisitive about the situation. Lastly, I'm very much on time, so I'll share a story with you. So prior to joining econ and public sector, I kind of thought that anything to do with infrastructure or local government, it is their job. I have my day job, it is their responsibility to take care of this for me. As I understood the importance to look into what are some of these decisions that these policymakers are making on my behalf, one of the first documents I read was Infrastructure Commission's infrastructure strategy. So if you're here, I'm a huge fan of your infrastructure strategy. The challenge is in implementation, I agree. So in the last 12 months, have you had your say on any central or local government consultation? If not, could these stakeholders benefit from your feedback on the future that they are building on your behalf? That's the end of my presentation. So remember I said two things for you to take away today. One, fast and furious. The climate is changing at a much faster and more furious pace than you and I could ever imagine. So our actions need to match up to that. Two, what was number two? No actions, no results. All you have is a good story. So this time next year when we come back together, would you have carry out some actions and deliver some results? Or you just got a good story to tell as to why we didn't get around to it? So thank you. Here's a QR code so you can reach me here, and always up for a conversation and hearing different perspectives. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you. I was too quick.
No, that's fine.
I have too long for questions.
We've been running over time.
Can you bring Simon back? Because the questions were really good.
Hey, thank you. That was so interesting, Waning. A few questions from the floor here.
Sure.
First of all, in your 6 steps you highlighted,
yes,
where are your clients winning and where do they get stuck?
Ooh, where are they winning? I want to say it depends. And I hate that answer. So I guess they get stuck on where do they start? And where do they even start comprehending where do I begin? So often I think that's the hardest first step that the client needs to take. And where they're winning is when they have started. They've started with options analysis, they've started to look into this matter. So it's okay if you do learn, but it's a challenge if you don't even start somewhere. Yeah.
Aside from electrification, where do you see New Zealand's biggest opportunity for decarbonisation?
Energy efficiency. I truly believe there is a whole lot of energy efficiency gains to be made in the ecosystem. There are smarter ways for us to manage energy in households, in buildings, in communities. We've all heard this before. If you ask people what they want, they will say they want a faster horse. We really need to change the narrative around energy, and actually, what are we truly solving for? If you are holding a hammer, everything is a nail. Let's reframe the narrative around energy and work out what are we trying to solve for before this is the solution.
What might that reframing look like?
I don't want to go into degrowth versus green growth, but that reframing looks like how we live, how we perceive as social norms. I'm sure people have seen, maybe not, there is a part, sort of a chart that talks about whether it is a personal change, a behavior change versus a system change. But personal behavior change only takes care of 1/3 of the emissions reduction we need to reduce in terms of our climate pathway. But 2/3 is requiring the system change. How do we give politicians the social license to actually change?
What advice do you have for financial focused senior and board leaders when it comes to prioritising decarbonisation?
I think the key thing is to really look at your climate transition risks. To look at your climate transition risks and correlate that to your climate physical risks, and using that as a trigger point for you to go, if this situation was to happen this way, because some of us may be familiar with RCP pathways around the 1.5 degree scenario or when it's going to come. It is not too far away. And if we are naively thinking that my business will be fine, I think that's a pretty, what is that, ostrich head in the sand scenario? Yeah. And recently I've been looking into agriculture and horticulture. It is really suffering in New Zealand, that sector. So a business that I was reading into had already suffered 30% profit margin decline because of rainfall, and they are losing quality of their fruit product and also decrease in yields. It is real for our business. So I can't remember what your question was, financial, and it all ties back to the bottom line, because you could diversify what you do, and instead of continuing down the same pathway, being kind of ignorant around what's happening around us.
Your point is that there actually is no distinction between financial interests and decarbonisation.
Yeah,
those two things are inextricably
linked.
And whatever your short-term incentives might be from a financial perspective, your medium and long-term financial perspectives are absolutely going to dwarf anything in the short term.
Yeah, unless you're looking to get out in the next 12 months, then yeah.
Maybe you own Auckland Airport shares, I don't know.
Sell it.
You say we should act fast and furious. A question from the floor: how do we do that without creating sunk and regret costs?
Roadmap, which is what I talk about sequencing. I think if you don't consider your holistic business and actually just jump on the next thing that everyone else is trying to do, or jump on the next thing that your neighbor told you about, or some other business is trying to do, you haven't truly understand your business structure and what matters for you and what works for your business. So in this sort of carbon reduction space, we have a marginal abatement cost of carbon. So when you map out how it stacks up for your business and you plug it through sort of a value ease prioritization model. Yeah.
How important is getting the best price and the right structure for power and the economics of large projects, such as the dairy conversion? Yeah.
Very, 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 very important.
Can you expand on that for us?
I don't know how much details I can actually share, but often when people go into decarbonization projects, they think capital, they think CapEx. This is the key thing. I need to buy an electric boiler, it's very expensive, how am I going to fork out that money? Often the OpEx is actually going to balance out your NPV better. Once you negotiate a better OpEx over the long run, it actually works out so much better for you, for your business case, that gets it through the board and probably keeps your CFO relatively happier in terms of the decision you are making. So I would say consider both CapEx and OpEx, and again, it is not just a technology play.
And last question, how do we improve adaptive capacity in New Zealand?
I think you start with understanding the climate impact that we're going to have. And yesterday I heard many speakers talk about existing infrastructure versus the new things we build. So when you're building new things, think about fit for the future. When you're looking at your existing assets, I think I learned something from Chris from Tonkin Taylor the other day around design for maintenance, so thank you. And I think you really need to think about your existing assets. What are you going to do about that, rather than let's do the same old, same old.
This has been such an interesting conversation. Thank you for giving us
No,
your
thank
time.
you.
Join me in thanking Wan Ning Chua.
Thank you. Cheers.
Good job.